Hi, this is Carin Zissis.
And I'm Luisa Lamy, and this is a very special episode.
Do you want to know why?
We're turning 200. This is the 200th episode of Latin American Focus.
Over the years, we've put a whole lot into Focus, exploring a range of questions with guests from all across the Americas, covering everything from the Rio Olympics to NAFTA's renegotiations.
From El Salvador's Bitcoin gamble to how COVID-19 reshaped the region. We've gone from the ballot booth to the football pitch to the movies. But for this round, we decided to revisit some of the questions we asked in episode titles with 3 special guests.
We start with the 2023 episode called Will the Anti-incumbency Wave Reach Argentina and Guatemala? The short answer is yes, it did, in both cases. But in this big global election year, it's looking like Latin Americans are breaking the streak of voting out sitting candidates and parties. I spoke with Brian Winter, Editor-in-Chief of America's Quarterly and Vice President of ASCOA.
What's changed? Why are incumbents suddenly winning or able to win again? I think it's 2 things. I think one is that the economic malaise that was gripping the region at the end of the 2010s, the middle of the 2010s, has gotten a little bit better. Economic growth in places like Mexico, Brazil, really across the region is a little bit better than it was. And then also the pandemic has passed.
We also revisit a question from the 2022 U.S. midterms and an episode titled, What Do We Really Know About the Latino Vote? With the U.S. presidential election looming in November this year, our colleague Chase Harrison talks with Mark Hugo Lopez, Director of Race and Ethnicity Research at the Pew Research Center. Lopez explained what's on the minds of Latinos, who account for 15% of eligible voters and could play a big role in large and swing states.
Kamala Harris has improved her standing compared to Biden among Latino voters. But interestingly, Kamala Harris's entrance into the election campaign hasn't resulted in a decline in support from Latino voters for Donald Trump. It may very well be that we see Latino voters receiving more attention from campaigns and from candidates than we've seen in the past.
And finally, we take up a question from earlier this summer. In Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum won big. Now what? Back in June, we talked about how Sheinbaum's win could affect foreign policy, the energy sector, and cybersecurity. Now, in this segment, I talk with our own Carin Zissis, a month out from Sheinbaum's inauguration, about what to watch for as she takes the reins and her party's control of Congress grows.
We're excited to bring you this episode, and we encourage you to check the podcast notes for links to the original conversations we've had on these topics and more. This episode also marks another special moment for the podcast, as I'll be handing the reins over to our executive producer, Luisa.
But don't worry, Carin will be back with special guest appearances.
In the meantime, get ready as we prepare a series of episodes on a whole new range of topics.
From entrepreneurship to tech to global affairs.
Thank you for being with us. We appreciate all our listeners, whether they tune in close to home, here in the Americas, from cities like Tucson, Cartagena, and Guayaquil,
or as far away as Warsaw, Cape Town, and Osaka. So don't forget to follow us so you don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Latin American Focus on the platform of your choice. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina en Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us for the 200th episode of Latin American Focus. It's great to have you on. Thank you for being with us here. Now, last year, we ran an episode which was titled, Will the Anti-incumbency Wave Reach Argentina and Guatemala? As we know, it definitely reached both countries. We have Javier Milei, who was a definite outsider, who won in Argentina, and we had Bernardo Arevalo, who came from behind after he was polling about 7th, and he ended up not only coming into the first round, but winning the runoff and going on to sort of tumultuous takeover his presidency, but definitely saw the anti-incumbency wave continue. That was a question for last year. And interestingly, this year, in this year of elections, we now have seen that actually every incumbent or incumbent party has won. We're going to set aside Venezuela for a moment as a more conflicted story. But if you think about El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Panama, and Mexico, we're talking about all incumbents or incumbent parties. Is Latin America's anti-incumbent streak over, and why or why not?
It seems over. There were 5 years where it was virtually impossible to get reelected if you were an incumbent in the region or if you were associated in any way with the government party. Out of 21 elections in the region from 2018 onward that were free and fair, the opposition won in 19 of them. The only 2 exceptions were Paraguay, which is not exactly a test case. Paraguay is a whole separate story of its own. So the question becomes, what's changed? Why are incumbents suddenly winning or able to win again? I think it's 2 things. I think one is that the economic malaise that was gripping the region at the end of the 2010s, the middle of the 2010s, has gotten a little bit better. Economic growth in places like Mexico, Brazil, really across the region is a little bit better than it was. And then also the pandemic has passed. And the pandemic was like another blow to the way people felt about their lives, the way they felt about their governments. Now that that's passed, I think people are more willing to consider voting for continuity instead of change.
Most of the presidential elections this year, one thing that we can say is that there are some pretty strong figures behind all of these elections. So Bukele in El Salvador. We have Martinelli playing a role in Panama's election. We have Maduro not wanting to give up power in Venezuela and doing anything he can to avoid it. And we had AMLO in the case of Mexico. What do some of these strong figures tell us about the state of pro-incumbency in Latin America right now?
It tells us that personalities matter and politicians matter. And you can look at these structural factors, and that's what political scientists do. But ultimately, it's not like things have gotten that much better in most of these countries. What we're really seeing here is exceptionally talented, once-in-a-generation politicians that you've just named. I would leave Maduro out of the conversation for obvious reasons, but you look at Nayib Bukele, for example.
El Salvador ha roto todos los récords de todas las democracias en toda la historia del mundo.
Whatever you think of him, this is someone who is possessed of a truly exceptional talent. I mean, he's a great communicator. He's a good executive.
Pero que me recuerden como el presidente que no robó y que no dejó que nadie robara. Y el que robó lo metió a la cárcel.
Certainly lots of things about his record, including the human rights and democracy record, which you can dispute. But he's hugely popular, and Salvadorans and people all over the region, in fact, are interested in him and engaging with what he does. Same with Lopez Obrador. I mean, a different situation, but this is another person who no one doubts his ability to connect with everyday Mexicans.
Presidente que ha tenido México. Suerte, Hugo. Mucha suerte. Estamos contigo.
And we've seen that again and again over the last 6 years. Even though the economic record was not that great and the security record was really not that good, he still had, by Mexican standards, a high popularity rating and was able to get his preferred successor elected. Luis Abinader in the Dominican Republic.
Presidente Luis Abinader, el pueblo dominicano lo pide. 4 años más.
Really just an exceptional talent also. And so I think some of this is, yes, it's structural, but some of it has to do with who's actually on the playing field playing the game. And this was if any crop of incumbents was either going to get reelected or see their preferred candidates elected, it was probably this group.
And what about left versus right? Because we've spent a lot of this century talking about pink tides, second pink tides, looking at a pendulum swinging back and forth in Latin America. Where's the pendulum now?
Yeah, to be honest, you kind of lose track a little bit. There has been certainly somewhat of a shift to the left over the last couple of years in the aggregate. I mean, countries like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, all governed by left of center leaders. But now it seems like the pendulum is maybe swinging again. I mean, we saw the election of Milei last year. That's an important one. Some of the trends suggest that in the next election in Brazil in 2026, we may see somebody from the right, like the governor of Sao Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas. So we'll see. I mean, I feel like the left versus right is losing some of its importance with Latin American voters, and maybe here in the States as well. It's a separate discussion. I'm not sure that today's voters are really engaging through that lens. They're looking for voters who seem to understand their connections. And some of this 20th century framework of where leaders sit on that spectrum doesn't seem to be as much of a priority in people's minds as it used to be.
Speaking of priorities in people's minds, if we look at the 2010s, we talked a lot about corruption, and corruption shaped elections. We can even say that early in this whole anti-incumbency swing, a person like Lopez Obrador in many ways capitalized on an anti-corruption sentiment to win in 2018. If anti-corruption and anti-corruption movements were a defining issue in the 2010s, is there a defining issue in the 2020s?
If you had to pick one, it would be organized crime. You see this all up and down the hemisphere, and this is the reason why Nayib Bukele shows up in polls in a lot of countries as the most popular politician. Places like Peru, Ecuador, elsewhere, there's a lot of admiration for the approach that he's taken towards crime, and even with the questions about due process and respect for human rights that some people have. What you see in country after country is voters who are willing to set that aside because they feel desperate. They feel that their lives have become worse because of the spread of organized crime, which is not a new issue in Latin America, but has gotten demonstrably worse over the last couple of years, including in countries where it wasn't as big of a problem before, like Ecuador, like Chile, like Peru even. So, but there are other issues. I mean, one that is a little bit under the radar, but that you see people very worried about now is climate change. We saw a historic drought, water rationing in Bogota, which if you've ever been to Bogota, you know that it rains plenty there, but that's not, it's not enough. We saw worries about water rationing in Mexico City, where you used to live, a historic drought that produced such a bad harvest in Argentina 18 months ago that it may have helped swing the election toward Milei because it had an impact on the economy and inflation as well. So, that's another one that I think, even though people don't always name climate change as being in the front of their minds, it is really affecting local politics. And then the same challenge that we've seen for years now, which is a lack of economic growth and therefore a lack of generation of quality formal sector jobs. I said that economies have gotten somewhat better in the last year or two, and they have, it's true, but it's still not the kind of growth rates that would get us back to the boom years of the 2000s when you really saw middle classes grow and unemployment fall. And that was kind of the last big period of prosperity for the region. And I think voters feel that acutely. They remember that era, and they understand that things are not as good now as they were.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast.
Thank you, Carin. Here's to 200 more episodes of LatAm in Focus.
Thank you.
That was Brian Winter and Carin Zissis. You can read Brian's analysis of the region at americasquarterly.org. Next up, the race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is looking like a tight one. What role will the Latino vote play? How are they seeing the election? Pew's Mark Hugo Lopez gets into answers with Chase Harrison.
Mark, welcome back on the Latin America in Focus podcast.
Thank you.
It's been 4 years since you were last on the podcast, and many of the names we talked about the last time you were here are still the same names we're talking about in this election cycle. But there are certainly some differences with the way that voters and Latino voters are approaching this election. Over the past 4 years, what are some of the changes we've seen?
Well, the first one is just the size of the Latino electorate. It has grown by another 4 million people. So an additional 4 million Latinos are going to be eligible to vote in November. That puts the number at over 36 million. Another way that I think that the interest in Latino voters has changed is that there's greater interest in the population of Latino voters because of the diversity of the population. So that diversity, which is everything from Cuban Americans in South Florida to Mexican Americans in the Southwest, but also to differences among men and women, younger Latinos, older Latinos. There's so many distinctions within the population. That has perhaps been one of the different ways in which we see others engaging with and explaining the Latinos and Latino voters to politicians, to the public, to the press. It's really been an interesting 4 years to see that change in viewpoint.
You mentioned those 4 million new voters who will be voting in this election potentially for the first time. What do we know about young Latino voters, and how might they be the same or different from previous generations?
That's a really good question. Because of that 4 million voters that are additional over 2020, 3 million of that is coming from young Latinos born in the United States who have come of age here in the United States. That's, I think, the big story of the last 20 years. So on the one hand, this continues an ongoing story of rapid growth in the Latino electorate, largely being driven by U.S.-born Latinos who turn 18. But it's not just young Latinos who come of age, it's also the naturalization of many Latino immigrants who are in the country legally. So it's about 1 million people or so who have also become eligible to vote.
You mentioned naturalized U.S. citizens. I think when people think of the Latino voting bloc, they think of a community that has a relationship to U.S. immigration processes. And though we know that economic issues tend to be of first priority for Latino voters, immigration still holds particular importance. I saw in recent polling you did that Latino voters said they actually trust Donald Trump more than, at this time it was Biden, on the issue of immigration. What's going on there?
Well, this again reflects the diversity of views among the nation's Latino voters, and this extends to immigration policy. So we found that, for example, this year, when we asked about what would make the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border better, the top thing that Latino adults pointed to was more judges to adjudicate cases for asylum seekers. 60% said that. But we also found that about 54% said better security at the U.S.-Mexico border, and 1/3 said the deportation of immigrants who are in the country without authorization. Well, let me say that last part again. 1/3 of Latino adults, which includes many immigrants, said that the way to make things better at the U.S.-Mexico border would be to enforce deportations more. This isn't new. We've seen this before in our surveys of Latinos over the years, that not all Latinos are of the same view about how to handle unauthorized immigration. Yes, the vast majority say those who are in the country without authorization should be allowed to stay and maybe even have a pathway to citizenship. Many surveys show that over 70% of Latino adults will say that. But not all Latinos are of the same view, because some feel that it's been unfair, or in some way that those who have come as unauthorized immigrants have done so in a way that's outside of the system, while they themselves may have come to the system directly and took years to get to either legal status or citizenship. So it's interesting to see that this diversity about immigration experiences extends to attitudes about the ways in which Latinos see the U.S. immigration system and what can be done to improve it.
Immigration is an issue in this election cycle that Donald Trump is running heavily on.
Mm-hmm.
There was a narrative back in 2020 that Trump might win record numbers of Latino voters, though Biden held steady with Democratic averages of how they've performed among this group. Are you expecting to see Trump outperform what he did in 2020 with Latino voters?
Whether or not he will outperform 2020, I think still remains to be seen. But let me share some data that goes all the way back to 2016, because I do think this path of Donald Trump's growing level of support among Latino voters is an interesting one. So back in 2016, Donald Trump won 28% of Latino voters' support. Hillary Clinton won more than 60% of Latino voters' support. So in some ways, this looked more like what we had seen prior to the Barack Obama years. Now, in 2020, Donald Trump won about 38% of Latino voters' support. Not a record. That number fits in more with George Bush in 2004, but nonetheless, Trump improved over 2016 in terms of support he garnered from Hispanic voters, going from 28% to 38%. Our most recent survey from August, right before the DNC, shows that Trump has about 35% level of support among Latino registered voters. Kamala Harris, 52%. But Kamala Harris's ratings in this last survey we did are an improvement over Biden's showing in July of this year, where in July, 36% of Latino voters said they were going to vote for Joe Biden.
Hello, Chicago! Here's a fact. When Latinos vote, Democrats win.
So Kamala Harris has improved the standing of her standing compared to Biden among Latino voters. But interestingly, Kamala Harris's entrance into the election campaign hasn't resulted in a decline in support from Latino voters for Donald Trump.
Latinos, as you noted, are going to be a larger and larger share of the U.S. electorate. What does the future of U.S. politics look like when Latinos are a more and more influential bloc?
It may very well be that we see Latino voters receiving more attention from campaigns and from candidates than we've seen in the past, partly because the nation's Latino population is dispersed around the country. It's growing in many of what are today battleground states. But in addition to that, as we've been talking about, Latino voters' support for candidates has shifted over the years. Sometimes it's been very strongly Democratic. Sometimes you see Republican candidates make gains. What will happen in the future? It may be that Latinos are perhaps more of a swing vote than they have been in the past, and that may interest campaigns and candidates to reach out to them. So we'll have to see what happens, but it may be that Latinos are poised to get more attention from candidates and campaigns in the future.
Mark, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We'll have to have you back in 4 years, and maybe it'll be a Trump-Harris rematch.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, we'll have to see what happens. Thank you.
That was Hugo Lopez, an expert on Latino politics and culture and director of race and ethnicity research at the Pew Research Center, speaking with Chase Harrison.
And in our last segment, I talk with our own Carin Zissis about Claudia Sheinbaum's upcoming presidency in Mexico. Carin, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for swapping places with me now and being an interviewee. We heard you talk about Mexico and analyze Mexico all these years in a podcast, so it's great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm so glad to be talking with you, Luisa.
Carin, you've been talking and explaining Mexico to us through all those 200 episodes. So let's talk about this historical moment that happened in Mexico this year, the first woman elected president. Claudia Sheinbaum won the presidency of Mexico on June of this year with a massive victory. She has promised to continue the work of Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, who's known as AMLO, keeping his legacy. But in a way, if you look at them as people, as leaders and politicians that were elected, they couldn't be more different. She's a woman, she's younger than AMLO, she's an academic. What could be different in her administration?
I think that's a great question. And it's the question everyone is asking, right? Everyone is asking. She's really pledged this continuity. Even though she won in June, her victory was just certified this month in August. And on August 15th, she gave this speech in which she talked so much about the movement, about continuing this movement, about building on the movement that AMLO laid down. She described him as the best president in Mexico's history. She's been promising this continuity, and he set it up for her by, in February, unveiling 20 reforms. 18 of them are constitutional reforms that set the tone for the election. Morena, his political party and his political movement, they're going to come in with so much control in Congress that they're going to be working to usher through so many of his reforms. And she has said she's going to support them. When she ran for president, she said that she would back these reforms. Mm-hmm. So we can expect continuity around a lot of these different issues, but she has promised to do some things differently. be more focused on green energy. I think you've tapped into something that is really true. She has a very different trajectory than AMLO. AMLO actually got his political start in the hegemonic party of the 20th century. And she didn't really enter politics until he was mayor in 2000 and she worked in his government. She became a politician when Mexico was going through its democratic transition. Mexico has this history over the past century of presidents trying to pick their successors, doing through what is called the dedazo. They're pointing out the person that would follow them, trying to sort of set the deck up so that they could potentially influence the person who's coming in so that person could continue in their legacy. And that hasn't really worked out historically. So we're seeing a lot of ways that it's set up for this to continue. Obviously, he's her political mentor, but that isn't how it's been historically. And we have to see what happens when she takes office on October 1st.
One of the things that we're talking that obviously will be different is that she's a woman. Mexico elected a woman president in a time when other countries are voting for autocracies and for many leaders who are openly misogynists. How meaningful is the fact that she's a woman? What is this context that she will face as the first president of the largest Spanish-speaking country? And how much does this help her?
I think it's incredibly important, and it's something that has been inspiring for many. When she gave her speech upon officially becoming president-elect, she really focused on two areas. She focused on the importance of the transformation of the political movement of Morena. But the other portion of her speech was really focused on gender, was focused on being the first woman president.
Es tiempo de mujeres.
That now is the time of women. And she emphasized that in Mexico's 200 years of history, she is the first presidenta with an A.
She wants to be called presidenta, right?
She said you have to call things what they are, otherwise they don't exist.
Hoy podamos decir presidenta. Y no me cansaré de repetir que no es un triunfo individual. El día de hoy llegamos todas.
And she said, I'm coming not only with the history of so many important women figures who have been a part of building our country, but I also am coming, and I'm coming with todas. I'm also going to be representing all of Mexico's invisible women. We know that Mexico has huge issues with violence against women. And we also know that this is another economic weight for Mexico. And Mexico ranks, according to the World Economic Forum, it ranks 14th out of 146 countries in terms of political empowerment. But on the other hand, it ranks 109th out of 146 countries in terms of economic participation for women. And it's 122nd in the world in terms of women in the labor force. I mean, so there's this huge gap. When you say you're going to bring all the women, there's going to be this challenge. And it's really an economic challenge for the country to bring women into the economy, to bring women into the labor force.
You're talking about a lot of history and a lot of how this being set up for Claudia Sheinbaum to start her presidencies. We're getting to know who's going to be the next president of Mexico. But I also want to talk about the Mexico that Claudia Sheinbaum will inherit. Is the country very different from when AMLO took the presidency? We're talking about a 20 reforms package that it's on the floor now or on the line now being discussed. What will be helpful and what will be difficult for Claudia Sheinbaum's administration from now on?
Well, one could say that the fact that her political party and its coalition will have so much power in Congress is going to be something that should be helpful to her, right? But not necessarily, right? Because we have this idea of Morena as this one united party that they're all going to come together and they're all going to agree. But it actually has become a party that has absorbed so many people who have left other political parties, has become such an all-encompassing party, much like the PRI was this all-encompassing party in the 20th century. She's going to have to control all of these different factions, including factions that really backed AMLO, to back her and to back what she wants to do as president. So that, oddly enough, there could be some real challenges for her there.
Friendly fire, a common problem in leaders, in democracies, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, and she also has a bunch of other challenges that we could list. She wants to move towards green energy, but she's inheriting this movement that was run by a president who really focused on oil, who did not focus and did not believe in green energy. And so she has to try to do it within this framework that he has created. You know, she is also going to inherit a fiscal deficit of over 5% of GDP, which is the largest since the 1980s. And we've also seen that since she won the presidency, the peso has been dropping. A lot of financial institutions warning against downgrades, against different economic risks. So she's going to inherit a lot of challenges, and she's going to inherit a country that still is having an ongoing issue with violence and organized crime and a growing concern over extortion. She's going to have a lot of difficulties to deal with, even though her party has so much political control.
We're talking about the Congress Sheinbaum will be working with and what people in Mexico are calling sobrerepresentación. Morena, which we've been talking about all this time, it's already a political force, has been a majority in Congress in the AMLO years. And this time, the political party went beyond, as you said. It created a large, very important coalition with smaller parties, creating a supermajority in Congress. Could you explain a little bit about the importance of this super representation? What's at stake here? And why are people so concerned about this party having so much power?
Sure. I mean, I think that a lot of these things are coming together all at once, right? So, again, we just found out the final makeup of Congress. There is a structure in Mexico's Congress where in the lower house, 200 of the 500 seats are picked by proportional representation. And in the Senate, it's half the seats. Now, there are rules that go back that sought to rein in the PRI, the big hegemonic party that controlled politics for 70 years in Mexico, controlled the presidency for 70 years. For example, no party can hold more than 300 seats in Congress. Now, the laws and rules were party-based, not coalition-based. So we really, in this election, have seen this coalition building as part of it. And what ended up happening is that Morena has come out and said, oh, well, we got way below 300 seats, so there's no sobrerepresentación here. But together with the two parties, they are going to end up having huge control in the lower house and a huge amount of control in the Senate. Without getting too into the weeds, I'll just say, if we look at the lower house, Morena and its coalition won about 54% of the votes. They're going to have 74% of the seats.
Oh, wow. That's a huge difference.
And in the upper house, they won about 55%, and they're going to end up controlling 65% of the seats. So just below that 2/3 majority that you need to have a constitutional reform. Now, the thing is that this is not the first time that parties have used and played with the rules to gain more seats. And it is a matter of interpretation. And it has been approved by the Electoral agency. It's been a huge issue. And it's coming just at these times with these huge reforms that are going to drastically change Mexico, are coming through in AMLO's last month in office. So the judicial reform, which will see Supreme Court get elected. It's really important to understand that one of the counterbalances while AMLO has been in power has been the Supreme Court that has knocked back constitutional reforms he's tried to push through. And they are, under this reform, we would see the Supreme Court next year through a special election, according to the current draft, completely replaced, and for the Supreme Court justices to be directly elected through popular election, as well as we're going to be seeing direct election of magistrates. So it's this complete remaking of the judiciary. We're going to see, there's another reform that would see 7 autonomous agencies that govern education, transparency, energy, the antitrust agency, telecoms. Those would get absorbed into ministries and eliminated. The bottom line here is that Morena's coalition is hoping to push these reforms through in September, before Claudia Sheinbaum even becomes president. So that includes this huge reform to the federal judiciary, to these autonomous agencies. And then there's another reform that would see the 100,000 strong National Guard fall under military control. These and some other reforms, Morena is trying to push them through in September. So it's turning into a very busy, turbulent transition period. And we're seeing pushback. Really, in particular, on the judicial reform, both internationally and on the streets. About 50,000, 55,000 judicial workers have taken to the streets in protest.
So in a way, we're talking about checks and balances. We are having here, in addition, agencies and this very important body, the judiciary, being completely changed in this process. The US ambassador to Mexico released a statement saying that this was risky, that he believed that judicial reform could be something risky for Mexico's democracy. And you already spoke about the rating agencies. So how this can affect US-Mexico relations, and what do you think that she's going to do about it? Even though you don't have a crystal ball, I want to know, how do you think that she can deal with that?
I wish I had a crystal ball, Lisa, so that we could see what it's going to be like in a couple months and what she's going to do. It is true that the Ambassador Ken Salazar did issue a statement expressing concern about the judicial reform and the potential weakening of judicial independence and how that could have an effect on USMCA. Canada's ambassador issued a similar, voiced similar concern. Now, on August 27th, AMLO responded to both ambassadors, and he said he's going to pause dialogue with the US and Canadian embassies.
Son los que aplicamos. ¿Cómo le vamos a permitir al embajador, con todo nuestro respeto, que esto no es un asunto de pleito, de enemistades? Pero ¿cómo le vamos a permitir, sí, que él opine que está mal lo que estamos haciendo?
That's kind of a big deal. North America accounts for 30% of global GDP. Mexico is the US's biggest trading partner. And we could put this down to just AMLO making waves, especially towards the end of his presidency. But Sheinbaum later in the day came out and said she agrees with his decision. Claudia Sheinbaum will also be president when the United States and Mexico and Canada will be going through a review of the US MCA. So, all of these sorts of issues around these reforms and the conflicts that could happen around them don't make that review process easier necessarily. So that's why some of these alarm bells are going off. You raise US-Mexico relations, and just like I wish I had a crystal ball about what will happen with Claudia Sheinbaum when she becomes president, I don't have a crystal ball to say who's going to win the US election. And we know that whoever wins the US election is going to be something that's going to be crucial for US-Mexico relations because of border issues, because Mexico has been playing an important role in controlling the flow of migration to the United States. We know that on the Republican side, there have been threats against Mexico and to attack Mexico and against Mexico's sovereignty. So we would have to see how that played out in the case of a Trump administration. We would have the interesting case of 2 women presidents in North America at the same time if the Democrats win. So without knowing the outcome of that election, without knowing the degree to which Claudia Sheinbaum may or may not follow so faithfully as time passes, especially because we can talk about a little bit about when she first takes office, but what will happen? We're talking about 6 years. What will happen over time?
That's great, Carin. I totally understand you wanting a crystal ball. I think everybody wants that. I think in the next 2 months, things are going to change dramatically for North America and the world. Latin America has everything to do with that. So we have been saying in this episode that you will be gone for a little bit and I will be here holding the fort for you. And in 2025, we hope to get you as well as a guest, and then later as a host again to talk more about Mexico and to go in depth about on the sexenio of Claudia Sheinbaum. So thank you so much for giving this interview to us.
Thank you, Luisa. And I just have to say, there are, as we discussed in that last answer, there's a lot to watch in the Americas in the next couple of months. So I just suggest everybody just tune in and listen to Latin America in Focus. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Carin Zissis. And for the next months, you'll hear Luisa Lemmy hosting the show in my place. She produced this episode with associate producer Fabrizio Ricalde.
Thank you, Carin. The music in this podcast was Galopada by Ichiberê Zuark, performed for American Society. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. You can access other episodes of Latin American Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast and send us feedback at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever you get your podcasts.
Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you for listening, and here's to 200 more episodes.